Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here and see you guys. All right, so I guess I'm here to talk about animation, my career. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've been an animator for about 18, 19 years now, and pretty much exclusively in games. Um, and Mostly that was a choice out of, I started off wanting to be in film, but the realities of having kids, by the time I did kind of a career shift. I had a former career working in advertising and didn't start animating until I was about 30. And then and because it was a while ago, it wasn't as easy to learn animation. So um, I was pretty much self-taught. So it took me about 5 years to put together a demo reel, like working days, then coming home and learning how to rig. There weren't even like free rigs back in the day. So I had to learn how to like rig using weird clunky tools and make animations. And then I got a job offer in the Bay Area to work on my first game, which was a terrible, terrible game called Celebrity Deathmatch, where the company imploded halfway through working on it. But it got me out here and into the industry, and it was really exciting. And I'm still actually good friends with all the people I worked with back then. And Yeah, so the problem with games, the good thing with games is um, the projects tend to be a bit longer. So you're basically there settling in for a couple of years, whereas film is much more transitional, where they just kind of really need to ramp on and off. And that was a challenge to do with young kids. So I ended up in games and love animating. And I've definitely seen the industry change quite a bit, which has been interesting because when I started off, it was most companies were about 40 people companies for like around the PlayStation 2 days. And it was interesting because you could do a lot. Like you could, if you wanted to do some effects, you could do them. You could kind of jump in and be a little bit of a jack of all trades. In fact, a lot of places, they weren't even like animator roles; they were game artist roles. And so I'd go places and they'd be like, "All right, could you model the hero character?" And no. And so I ended up specializing in kind of rigging and animation, and then after a while, I deliberately let my rigging skills fall off because I'd end up having to kind of come in and do a ton of rigging on a project, which is then my reel wouldn't be as good because I'd be doing all the rigging. But it's also that's another area where it's become so specialized in an interesting way because now people are, effectively programmers and like high level problem solvers. And so I always have a soft spot for riggers because they can make your life so much better. But it's also important to know how to do these skills. Like basically, the more you can do, the better. All right, so it's my first ramble. I like to talk.
Can I jump in and some people may not know what rigging is. Do you mind describing what rigging is?
Sure. So rigging is when you animate a character. If you open up Maya and you're ready to go, someone's had to set up this character for you. So it has basically a skeletal system inside it where each joint is, to move a hand, there'll be just like an underlying structure of joints. And then there'll be usually a duplicate skeleton with controls to let you move stuff around. So it's this big kind of feat of engineering to do some, to make this a digital, what was I going to say? All right, it's got a question. Get that in a minute. But basically, it's setting up a digital puppet, and it's basically this kind of half art, half science way of doing this. So, yeah. So, I'm off track. Monica, point me in another direction to talk.
Okay, so you started with your career at the very beginning. You wanted to do film, but then decided to go into games. Now, is it something because you landed into games by just by purpose or by accident, or how did that transition happen?
It was kind of funny. I was back in the day, I just was animating for fun. I didn't really know what I was going to do with it. I kind of it was in the early days of 3D where it was more accessible to you, like basically having to do it on your home computer. Um, and before it was like you need like a Silicon Graphics workstation, a Maya, and that was like 40 grand for that package. So unless you were at a place where they had that and you could learn it, you kind of we all had to wait a few years until we could get software that was more accessible. But it was also pretty clunky. But so long story short, I ended up doing this little like stop motion style piece just because I liked Wallace and Gromit and stop motion, and I got a job offer. Someone looked at it and said, "Hey, do you want to interview for this job out in California, doing working on a stop motion game? We really thought you nailed the style we're working on." And so I flew out to the Bay Area from New York City and accepted it. Moved out here and took a massive, massive pay cut to start my career over, like in my early 30s. Um, but it was really exciting, incredibly fun. Um,
Nowadays, though, I think you mentioned there was a little while ago, but now, do you feel like education and knowing the animation, like stop motion or 3D animation, do you feel like you have to cater to certain companies to be able to apply to those jobs, or how do you feel about, learning the skill and the needs of the company?
well, that's a really, really good question. So it in the early days, you could be a lot more of a generalist and you could kind of just figure stuff out as you go. Now, because there's so many schools out there and there's the industry is a lot more mature, um, you really like say if I was going to work like I'll give you an example. So I've worked at a bunch of places and what I've kind of done is I jump back and forth. I'm much probably better at cartoony animation, and that's more my skill set because that was my interest going into it. Um, but I've jumped around back and forth between motion capture, high level realism jobs, because there's more of those out there, especially at the higher levels. But like the AAA titles are generally more like that. So I don't have just a standard demo reel. I basically have a lot of animation pieces that I assemble and target to each company I'm applying because it's really specific now. And I learned my lesson because years ago, I like really wanted to work at LucasArts and work on Star Wars because, an animator who doesn't want to work on Star Wars. And so I just put together my reel, stuff I thought was good, but um, what I didn't research was what they were working on at the moment, which was a very highly realistic game. And so they assembled a team of really realistic animators, and I showed my cartoony reel, and the lead just looked at it, didn't say a word, got up and walked away, and someone said, "Interview's over." And I was like, "Huh, that was kind of sucky," um, but it taught me a lesson, which is show work that's appropriate to the company you're applying for. So if I was going to apply to Industrial Light and Magic, I would show a very, very realistic um, reel. I would show edited motion capture, and I would show it at the level. They pretty much want to see like stuff that looks like a shot from one of their films, um, at least a good enough attempt at it. Not with the lighting and everything, but they want to see the motion that's solid enough. If I was going to apply to Pixar, I'd show really, really well done acting pieces, and so on. If I was going to apply to a game animation studio, um, that's when it really pays to do your research about what sort of job it is. Because in the old days, I used to do a lot of like game cinematics. I do a lot of cutscenes. I do in-game animation, and that's become really stratified. A lot of those all are outsourced, or there's individual cinematic teams within it that are separate from the regular animation team. When I was at Crystal Dynamics working on the Avengers, that was easily, excuse me, the biggest team I'd ever worked on. There was maybe 30 to 40 animators. And it was like a film production, and they had gameplay animators. Within the gameplay animation department, there were guys who worked on the hero characters, guys who worked on the enemies, and dealt with AI and movement and logic, and worked with some of the programmers to get good movement systems. And that's a little more what I worked on because I tend to be a little more technical than a lot of animators. So they often put me on stuff that's not as, flashy, but if, for a game, having an enemy move in a not very interesting way isn't really fun, because, you could have like the strongest punch in the world, but unless you have a really good reaction to it, it's not going to feel good. And so I kind of over the years became more specialized as a gameplay animator, and that's, I guess, what I'd call myself at this point. So I mean, really, it's especially because of the amount of people out there looking for jobs, I kind of feel like you really have to do your homework, and and this is, I'll digress a little bit. This also, if you guys are interviewing for internships and things like that, and this is just kind of a general life skill, like people, if you're interviewing, it's really good to be proactive. Come in with questions that show interest in what you're doing, or in what the company's doing. So if I was interviewing someone for an internship and they said, "So I really like the games in this company from here to here to here. Did you work on any of those? Like what?" And ask questions about those, and show that they've done some research and are interested in what my company was working on. And it's also a good icebreaker, so you're not just sitting there quiet in an interview waiting for a question to be asked. It's kind of, I think, good to come in with a plan of attack of for example, when I interviewed at Crystal Dynamics, my boss was like, "Yeah, I've been here for 19 years." I was like, "Wow, so did you work on like this project and this project? What did you do on that?" Ask him about some of the and I was generally interested because I've followed these games for years, and asked them when did you guys step up your technology, this and that. And it was actually a really fun question, because a fun interview, because I got to ask questions that I always wondered about, and and I didn't play a lot of it. I didn't have, I didn't play the last game, but I'd go through and that's the good thing about YouTube, is you can just do walkthroughs and go through it all and get a good sense of what it's about. But I would say, other than having a good attitude, being someone that they would want to work with, showing interest, and that goes for tailoring your reel, to, for example, if someone from Industrial Light and Magic said, "Hey, we're working on this project with dragons. We might have some spots opening up in a few months." And I wanted to work there. I'd sit there and I'd start animating bats that day and get really good at it, and build a reel, build some example pieces to put onto my reel that showed that "Hey, I heard you're working on some dragon things. Here's all these bat animations I did," where I explored the movement and flight, because that would it's kind of doing your homework.
I think that's really good tips, like doing the research of the company, making sure that you know what games are being released, knowing what type of technology they have, if you can find it, just being ready for the interview. I think that's really helpful tips if and when people get interviews. So thank you for that. Michael Curran has a question. Michael.
Awesome. Hey, Monica, thanks for doing this. Jeff, thanks a ton for being here.
Sure.
I'm the head baseball coach here at Ohlone and teach kinesiology. So I'm not a big video game guy, but I got 3 boys with me right now who are fired up to see us. Awesome. So I appreciate you a ton. Hey, two kind of practical questions. I guess they're wondering, we're getting ready to send a couple of them off to college pretty soon. Number one, what do you recommend maybe they study at a 4-year institution? And then number 2, on a practical level, how do they kind of get in the business? What are some internship places, and what are some things you recommend to help them do what you're doing someday?
That's a good question. Those are all good questions. And I have a son who just started college this year too. So I think for animation, it's really specific. It used to be, I actually don't think your degree, like if you want to get into animation, your degree does not matter that much. I would probably like as much art, anatomy, like art matters, anatomy matters. You know, anything helps. But for to get an animation job, the only thing that matters is a demo reel. Degree doesn't matter. No one's asked me my GPA. There's a second career, so I have an English degree, and I have a master's degree in painting, and that got me into like photo retouching and work in advertising. But no one has ever asked me what my GPA was or anything about my educational background. All they care about is my demo reel.
Okay, so it'd be kind of very similar to if I get film on a picture, I want to see what this kid can do. So you guys want to take a look at maybe what he's produced and what they're kind of doing, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then like I said, on a practical level, once they're done with college, how do they kind of break in? Is it internships? Is it just pounding the pavement and looking for companies to interview with, or what are your recommendations there?
Connection, networking.
Okay.
Like networking is the single biggest thing, because just sending out, it's like making cold calls. It's it's like I think this is kind of how the world works, and not a nepotistic way, but I think people like some kind of connection, and it works both ways. I actually got hired by a student of mine a couple of years ago. It was just like, oh, my teacher, like old teacher is great. I learned a ton from him. He'd be really fun to work with, and that was a good experience. But I think like looking for like internships is like getting a reel together, getting some work together, and just applying early. I think internships, there's a narrow window of like, you don't start applying in like April. I think by that time they're all taken. So I think from like January you start really applying for internships, and it doesn't have to be somewhere glamorous. It doesn't. I mean, obviously, if you're getting an internship at Pixar, it's going to go well for you professionally. But I would find places that you like or nearby. In the Bay Area, there's tons of studios nearby, and just start calling their HR departments or emailing, finding who the HR person is on LinkedIn, and email and say like, I'm a student, really interested in an internship. Could I apply? And a lot of places, they may not have a formal internship program, but they might be like, yeah, we got a lot of work. We could probably use a little bit of help. Why not get some students in? So I think being proactive,
I appreciate that. Very, very helpful, and good to know as a dad that I don't have to search for certain universities that have this certain very specified major, because I think they're interested in, one might do engineering, one might do business. You're saying they'd be fine doing that, and as long as they've got a reel and stuff like that, correct?
Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. Hey, I appreciate it very much. Thank you again.
Let's see. There's some comments saying internships are usually for students going to school. I think that's correct. Yeah, it's also easier to get an internship if you're a student.
A little bit more about networking. Another way that you guys can network is going to conventions. So for example, we're very lucky to have GDC, which is Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, and that one is huge. So it's a really great place to not only know what's going on in the industry, what future trends are, but also it's a great place to meet recruiters, artists just like you, and just make connections all over, like all the time. So definitely take a look at conventions like GDC, CTN, SIGGRAPH. Those are all really great places to find people that are just as passionate as you are and also make connections. And
you can also volunteer for a lot
that's
of these
right.
places too.
Another thing that I noticed, this is Isabel, is, meetups. There are meetups all over. There is a game design meetup in actually in San Jose, which is super cool. Like, it's usually 30 people and they all work in the industry. So I highly recommend going to those meetups because they're always looking for people there.
All right, Jeff. So I have another question for you. So you started off at Celebrity Deathmatch, and then somehow you end up working for Star Wars, Mafia 3, Avengers. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Sure. So I was at a company that was folding. I moved out here. I had a kid on the way, and I got a job down the road at a place called Stormfront Studios, working on who had just come out with the Lord of the Rings game. And so, and that was a very much more stylized, it was kind of like Devil May Cry level realism. And so I jumped onto that. It was a bit of a sweatshop. And let's see, I think I should pull up my LinkedIn. So yeah, so I worked there and did a little bit of freelance, and then ended up at a really good company called Shava Games, where I worked there for about 2.5, 3 years before that also imploded and fell apart. And that was really fun. I worked on some Tony Hawk games. I worked on a Shrek game. And it started off not super high profile. It was an Activision studio, and they kind of have a history of like inflating their studios to like a massive amount. And so it's a really different experience working on a 40-person team versus a 250-person team. So that they weren't really capable of like scaling up that fast, and they couldn't handle the project, so that place imploded. But it was a really great experience. I got to like do meet all these like skateboarders that I like saw from like time I was like a little kid, and I did the PlayStation Portable version of this Tony Hawk game and launched it, and it was exciting. There was a lot of really good things there. From there, I moved on to Sega Studios, which was originally called Secret Level, where I worked on Golden Axe, and that was a very realistic game, all mocap, but the mocap wasn't usable because of the way they shot it, and so I ended up working on the hero character, which was a pretty cool thing. I never done that before, so that was a big kind of feather in my cap, and it was great. And then Sega
Can I
acquired
ask
them.
you what motion capture is? Because you say mocap, and I don't think people know what motion capture is.
So motion capture, that's a good question. So motion capture is when they put someone in a suit and physically record their movements, then you transfer it onto your character. And so it's pretty much all big realistic games now all use motion capture. It's become much, much better. And a lot of places, like when I was at Crystal Dynamics, they had a motion capture studio right on the floor. And so they had a bunch of people that were really athletic on the team who would do like most of the motion capture, and then hire like martial artists and things to come in and do specialty stuff. So it was pretty interesting, and it's a really different skill set. It's a really different skill set to what was I going to say, to edit motion capture, because there are these big long files, and you have to kind of speed up the timing and still preserve a sense of realism, and it's a whole thing. I don't know if that answers that.
It did. Thank you.
But it's one of those things where it's worth actually downloading some free motion capture and like playing around with it and trying to edit it just to see what it's like, because it's like using your animation skills in a more technical way, but it's a super important skill to have. And so I actually, man, it was actually kind of interesting because they had a thing where they had one button mapped to the motion capture and one button mapped to my moves, and they were trying to decide whether they were going to go hand keyed or motion capture. And so fortunately they went with hand keyed, and so it was a more fun project for that. But yeah, I mean, motion capture it's here to stay, and it's, you know, it's important. I would say it's a pretty vital skill to know how to edit as an animator. Were I to put together a more realistic reel, I'd probably have some mixture of motion capture blending into hand keyed back into motion capture to show like that I could work with a level of realism that was as good as motion capture and could fill in the pieces between motion capture.
That's great. Do you mind if I show your reel?
Go for it.
And you can talk a little bit about it?
Yeah.
So this is Jeff's reel, and just to demonstrate some of his amazing skills that he has, this is from Wild Beyond. Maybe some of you guys have played this. So the music's very cool. I'm going to go ahead and mute it. Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about this animation?
Yeah, it's not showing up on mine, but I know what it looks like. So.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so basically this is the first.
Actually, that's a good question. Does anyone see it?
Yeah, it's showing up for me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we can see it.
Thank you.
Let's see. Yeah, so this is basically was the first mobile game I worked on, and it was pretty challenging to work in mobile, surprisingly. And there were some good and bad things about mobile. Mobile games are a different culture than like traditional game studios. They more have the culture of like a tech company. However, it was really fun working on these like charming little, you know, cartoony models, and just trying to like inject as much entertainment as I could within them. So that was a pretty fun thing. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Mobile companies are different than, I mean, I think the reel speaks for itself. They're just sort of like silly, charming little, or attempting to be charming little animations that make you want to play the game. The actual gameplay animations are not interesting at all because they're like so small on the phone that you can barely tell what's going on. So there wasn't really that much to do for those. But so you spent all your kind of budget on these little kind of interstitial character moments, which for an animator is really fun. But yeah, but mobile companies are really different because they really have the culture of a tech company where they're constantly running metrics on what you're doing, constantly sending it out for testing and giving you feedback that's like, does this animation, will it sell more things? And it's a weird kind of way to work, because a lot of times your creative direction isn't coming from creative, but coming from testing and focus tests, and that can be. I've never really got used to that because I'm not convinced that testing's accurate enough. Like it's hard to like quantify, is my animation charming enough to sell more units of whatever they're trying to sell. I don't think it 100% works, but they have all these, you know, Ivy League data modelers who are really convinced that's how it goes, and so you just kind of roll with it and make changes. That's also another thing when you're working for someone else. You really have to be flexible about making changes for the sake of the project, even if you feel like sometimes I've made my animations worse to make it more consistent with the rest of the animations. And that's kind of what your lead is. I would say, like, my best advice is to trust your lead animator. And when they're asking you to make changes, don't be defensive about it. Just make those changes gracefully. And you know, that was one of those things when I started off as an animator. It was challenging because you get to a point where you get your animation pretty good, and then you sort of have this fear that if you make a change, you're not going to get it that good again. And then I was like a little resistant to making changes because it's like, yeah, I don't know. Because in my head, I was like, I don't know if it's going to get it to that same level. It might just be worse. And sometimes that would happen, but as you get more experience, that's not really so much a worry, because you can make it good. And generally, as an animator, the more you work on it, the better it gets. And that's just kind of how it goes. And often just, you know, trusting, basically, generally, when better, like more advanced animators give you feedback, it can be kind of liberating because they're basically helping you solve your problems. And it's giving you a little list. It's funny, a friend of mine, he's he's one of the lead animators at Disney, and he got his start at Blue Sky, and they'd hire like tons and tons of interns and apprentice animators, and a lot of guys would just be like, or women, they'd just be like, get these changes and be like, yeah, I don't know, I don't agree with that. And he'd sit there, and his attitude was really humble. He just wrote down everything they said, made all those changes, and he said, they just basically gave me this list of how to make my animations more awesome. And he got a staff job there, and his career has been spectacular ever since. But that's, I guess, my other advice I'd want to impart is a sense of, you know, humility in being receptive to learning and making changes.
I think that's a good tip. It looks like Samuel, you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Firstly, I want to say, Mr. Cooperman, thank you for being here and providing this presentation, everyone. We really appreciate it. I have a couple of questions I wanted to run by you since you're a veteran in the industry. So just a little bit about myself for context for the question. I worked as an intern at Ubisoft in San Francisco.
Okay.
I worked on the community management team a few years ago during the launch and live phases for a couple of their games like Watch Dogs 2, For Honor,
Okay.
Rocksmith, Mario Rabbids. And so my overarching goal back then was I always wanted to get into level design.
Yeah.
So I returned to school, and I'm a computer science major currently.
Mm-hmm.
Although, you know, things changed. So now I've kind of taken a passion into graphic art.
Yeah.
And so I really like designing logos and visual design. And I want to be a graphic artist, but I don't really have traditional art skills like pencil sketching or painting. I'm kind of better with software, and I'm a little more technical, kind of like how you said about yourself. And so I wanted to ask you, what advice would you have for someone who wants to work on games as a graphic artist? You know, is there room on a game dev team for someone like me? And maybe there's some standard software you could recommend learning, something that's accessible with minimal barrier to entry.
Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, actually, I have a former background as a graphic designer, so that's what I did. My background was I went to art school for painting, and that led to kind of being a photo retoucher in the advertising industry. And as I was there and there was a need for it, I kind of basically learned graphic design through just a lot of hard work and just being in the right place at the right time and getting opportunity. I think graphic design, well, the thing is, like, when you say graphic design, there's no graphic design for games. There's UI design, there's UX design, and then there's the graphics that come with texturing. And so without knowing any of your work or background or experience, I would say, you know, you could always, like, I mean, I think like education isn't something that stops. Like, having a computer science degree is not going to preclude you from being a level artist. I think you can bring all your skills. Basically, you can play to your I always encourage people to play to their strengths. And so if you have an interest in doing like logos, do lots of logos and then figure out where that's going to fit in. I mean, you could design, like what I would say is do something like the Unreal Engine or Unity and like build some environments and build some, make a lot of like posters, like make a shopping mall with a lot of cool designs and posters, design an environment that you think is really cool and appealing with things that you like in them. And I think you'll probably find a way to make that work because, you know, like level artists, some are architects, some people have come from different experiences, but I think if you're making stuff that's compelling, you'll be able to find a way to do it, like to do things with it. Because a lot of times with games, there's a lot of like invented branding that goes with things. If you look at things like, I don't know, think a game like Mirror's Edge or something, where they have this whole like futuristic city, and they've basically had to invent kind of this graphic language of products and things that are all just invented. I don't know. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that was very insightful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I got one other quick question,
Yeah.
which may not have like a clear-cut answer, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this. In terms of the process, do you have much creative control over your animation and the direction you want to take the art, or do you have to fulfill requests that come from the dev team, or how does that work?
It varies, actually. It's a good question. I hit a point in my career where I would rather have a job that gives me a little more creative control than a place like, I mean, for example, like the Avengers project, I took that because I knew it was a high profile project. It would look good on my reel. It's impressive. It's more marketable. But the work was a lot, like there was not a lot of creative control over what I did. There was some, I did some pre-visualization of some of the superhero finishers where I'd have like Thor like rise in the air and like throw a hammer down and dive down and grab it and then smash a robot or something. So there were some, but not a lot. It was more just the creativity was in the execution. And a lot of times the motion capture was shot and I was just kind of editing it and so I was responsible for timing. Like right now I'm working on this like cartoony golf game and I have full creative control over it. Like they'll basically say, all right, here's this mermaid character playing golf. Have her kind of seem like she's in the water but playing golf and do all these moves. And so I get to be pretty inventive with it, and that's really fun. It makes for a satisfying way to spend the day, if that makes sense. But it varies. A lot of times when I've worked with other companies, there'll be, say, like a combat designer. There's like this guy, Marcus Arrow, used to work with the Sega, who also worked at Ubisoft. I think he worked on Watch Dogs. And he would have some, like, he was like a martial artist and had some clear ideas of what he wanted to do for the combat. And then I'd kind of like, I'd say, well, look, you know, martial arts, I don't. I'll video you, and then let me block it in and put my own spin on it. Some places are more like matter of fact. They're just like, we need an area of effect animation. So have them like the character smash the ground somehow. So it varies. It varies on the structure of the team, the roles of people, and what they're looking for.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you. I did find another one of your reels is it's a little older, but I still think it's got some charm. Just to demonstrate some of the cuteness here that you have done in the past. So this is your 2014 reel.
Okay, cool. I can even see it now.
Can you or you can't?
I can.
So can you tell us a little bit about quadruped versus biped animation, and then you also have like robots as well. So how do you find one more challenging than the other? Do you are there any little tips you would recommend?
Sure. I mean, with quadrupeds, well, it's all challenging. I mean, let's see. Well, quadrupeds are, fortunately, there's a lot of reference for it, and there's some like systems of doing them. But basically, I would say like figuring out, like just being a student of motion is kind of what you need to do. If you want to learn how to like, if someone says, "Can you animate this lion?" And if you just sit down and start animating without referencing anything, it's not going to work out for you so well. And so I do a lot of studying. What I would do is actually, I had a little system where I would take little almost motion. I would basically take some video and I'd stabilize it of like, say, like a rhino walking. And I put little dots and physically I'd put it as a plate in Maya. And so I'd have like dots going the pattern of like the ankle and the knee. And then some like spheres for like the front of the chest and the back. And then you can kind of get a sense for the speed of it and almost abstract it into just like motion capture almost. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's, I mean, it depends. When there's in these little, some things you can't, like if someone says animate this dragon, there's no reference for dragon, but you could like look at how a large bird flies. You can look at how a bat flies and study the wing pattern, and then see how that works. And so it's interesting because I learned that technique from a guy who was a really good creature animator in Industrial Light and Magic, and he was like much older. He was like in his 60s, and but he was super enthusiastic, and he viewed everything as a learning opportunities. Like anytime I get a new creature, it's this chance to go in and like study how that creature works. I saw a couple of questions here. Do illustrations skills have any relevance in game animation? Yes. What's it like to be a character designer using the skills? Well, character designer has well, basically, if you are a really good 2D animator, you have a huge leg up over most animators. I sometimes, just to keep my skills sharp, and I'm someone with like a fine arts degree, but I was a good painter. I was never a great like hyper realistic artist. And my 2D skills, I was someone that had to like really draw a lot to keep my 2D skills sharp. And like I couldn't just sit down and get a likeness in the face. I'd have to like draw every day for hours to kind of get my skills to that level. But I do a lot of drawing for animation, and a lot of things that really are. Let me find a link. Let me find a link for you guys. It'll be interesting.
While you do that, I've noticed that you mentioned Maya a couple of times. Is that the primary software you have been using while you've been an animator?
Yes. That's pretty much become industry standard. When I started, it was 3D Studio Max and Maya were the kind of like the two things that they were split between. And it's kind of become Maya.
Now, because you use motion capture, do you also use motion builder, or do they they already? Oh, you do use motion builder too.
I use motion builder a lot. Some places, when I was at LucasArts, our lead decided we shouldn't use Maya at all. We should only use motion builder, and he built a whole pipeline around motion builder. And no one was happy about that. Because it's not as precise a tool, so it's hard to get like really accurate poses. So I just sent this link out, and if you look on, I think Flickr, there is. Oh yeah, there we go. I found it. Victor Navone, who's a pretty famous animator, as much as any animator's famous. He does these really amazing, really simplified like sketches for his. It shows his like planning process, and this is about the level I draw for my animation. And sometimes I'll use little 2D animation tools. I'll like just practice little like bouncing balls on my phone just to keep my skills sharp. But what I think 2D skills are really good for, not good for, but where it can really give you a leg up is line of action and doing sketch over. So what I'll do in my process, especially when I'm doing something cartoony, is I'll do my animations and then I'll go in with like this digital grease pencil and I'll sketch over my poses and make them better, because it's easier to make your poses really shine doing something kind of hand drawn versus not. If that makes sense.
That's great. These are beautiful.
So
in the chat, everybody, you can find the link in the chat. Let's see. Jen, you have a question? Jen Oliver?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you, Mr. Cooperman, for taking the time to meet up with us. So I asked this earlier, but I guess the chat kind of just scrolled through. Going back to networking, how would you go about networking during the pandemic? Because I've noticed that unless it's someone that you know, a lot of people don't really look at emails or reply to emails from strangers.
I think that's true in non-pandemic times too. I think that's like why it's a good question, because I think about if I lost my job, how would I get another one right now? And that's something that fills me with dread, because I'm like, crap, because I can't go out for a drink with somebody and, you know, meet other people on their team, or, you know, like it's a challenge, and it's something we're going to have to all deal with. I think that finding a way to, and I don't know if Facebook groups or kind of Zoom meetups are the way to do it, but I think you know, I mean, in the old days there was this thing, an informational interview, where you could just ask for a kind of like a almost like a test interview, where you meet someone and say, you know, like find someone on like online or somewhere and say, look, I'm a student, I'm trying to break into the industry. Would you mind having an informational interview with me? Take a look at my work, let me know what you think. Any suggestions of how to target myself more effectively. And that can be a good way to, you know, like that can be, like that's kind of how I got my start when I didn't know people in a certain industry. And it became a good way, like that ended up being kind of helpful down the road, because you're basically just having a conversation with someone and they're more inclined to have some goodwill towards you, especially if you then go back, work hard, show them your work, say, hey, I took your advice, did this. And that's kind of like, those are kind of the ways like one can get a mentor. And it's not, there's no cut and dried way to do it. And I'm just kind of sounding stuff out because I don't really know. I don't know the, you know, I don't think anyone knows, because it's such a weird time. The one thing people do have now is time. You have time and captive audiences. So if you can find people that are willing to speak with you, it's easier because they're home. They have, you know, like I'm working today, but I can take an hour and chat with you guys. I don't have to go anywhere to do this, and it's pretty easy to fit that in. And so, on the same note, maybe if someone said, would you mind having a Zoom chat, like talking about my work and some suggestions for my career, I'd be happy to do that to somebody. No one's ever asked me that, but I think finding ways, I mean, I think, you know what it is, it's being resourceful. And it's being resourceful and being personable is really what it is. Like, and I think finding, when people say pound the pavement, what does that mean? It seems like kind of it's this abstract thing of like, how do you, and this is the hardest thing. I remember when I was starting off in my career, like right out of college, I had no idea what to do, like how to get a job. And I ended up having to like work in a bookstore for a while, and like it was like a legal temp for like a year and a half until I kind of did these things. But you've like figured out who to talk to. And it started for me, it started off like family friends, someone who like worked in advertising. And I talked to me, said, you have no portfolio. No one's going to give you a job. You got to go take some classes. And so it's like, okay, that was not what I wanted to hear, but good advice. So I went until I had some work to show. I couldn't really talk to anyone. Once I had some work to show, people said, you know what? Maybe I could hire you for an illustration. And so I built an illustration portfolio. And I had a very, I don't want to say haphazard, it wasn't a very traditional career. I mean, I started off doing, I was like basically working in a bookstore right out of college, temping at night, and then had a couple of days where I was just going around trying to like talking to people, trying to figure out what to do. And then after I got a little bit of focus, I took some classes, put together a specific graphic design portfolio, got some skills, computer skills, and then got an internship. And then, where I basically said, look, I really need to get a portfolio. I'm begging you to like let me work for free for a little while. And so part-time, and someone took me on, and he actually had a master's from Yale, and he taught me graphic design like from the ground up at a very rudimentary level, but enough that I could go in and get a job doing some sort of graphic design. So it's everyone's path is different, but I actually don't know the it's a good question, because I ask myself this a lot, like how does one network when you don't have the opportunity to meet anybody? And I think it's the question a lot of people are asking themselves right now.
So I'm going to encourage everybody that if that's a fear, that GDC, SIGGRAPH, all the conventions they're going virtual, and they provide networking opportunities. So definitely take advantage of those. And for the alumni or that are currently going to the college, I would look at LinkedIn and take a look at your college and who the alumni are, because they're a huge resource. The key is to find a connection with them. So because let's say they went to Ohlone and you reach out to them, even if it's cold, you can say, hey, I'm an Ohlone student. They already they already have a connection with you. So they might spend more time with you just because of that. And the biggest thing is not asking for a job. That's the one that you don't want, because you'll get an immediate no. What you want is feedback. And that's a lot easier for people to give back. So don't say, I want a job. What you're saying is like, I'm still learning. Would you please, if you have the time, can you please give me some feedback? And a lot of the times, if they have the time, they'll say yes. And it's okay if they say no, because you don't know what's going on in their life. But some people will say yes, just like Jeff said, he would probably say yes. No one's actually done it to him yet. But if he did, he probably would consider it. So we are
really good advice, because alumni are going to be.
I'm sorry, we are about to run out of time. Ken has a quick question.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I have to set it up though as well. I don't know anything about gaming.
Okay.
That doesn't mean I'm not interested in some information. So I got to set this up, like, on a Likert scale from 1 to 10. People know about that. Mike, I'm expecting an answer of 10, but on a Likert scale of 1 to 100. So I really love languages, and I can spend all day studying a language. I'm wondering if you, and I just realized that Monica might be able to help me too, know of any real basic program of animation that could be manipulated by somebody like me who don't know a lot about all that stuff, where I can change it into motions that I can put language action into and develop my language skills. So real basic program or something like that is what I'm wondering about.
The problem with animation, unless you're like, what I would do is I would start with 2D. I would get, so there's a lot of like free 2D animation programs. Start messing around with 2D because it's instant quick communication and it gets you like motion and feel really fast. Once you get into computer animation, it's technical. It's not intuitive. It's like half computer science, not even computer science. It's just half a lot of nitpicky details. Like if you're animating a character, so think about how many bones you have in your hand. So if you're drawing it, you can do this like pose, like this. If you're posing it, you have to go tink, 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 like that to get like that shape. And so it's a lot slower, it's a lot less intuitive, it's a lot more mechanical. Whereas 2D is, you know, you draw a line, you draw a shape. It doesn't even have to be perfectly detailed. It's as long as it feels like that shape. So that's what I'd say. That's, you know.
I think Ohlone does provide 2D animation classes, and another class you may consider is motion graphics, Ken. It does use something called After Effects. It is a computer-based software, but it will kind of teach you how to create like motion that you may be able to translate into language. Great. And Jeff, I know we're running out of time. Is it okay to answer one more question?
Of course.
Thank you so much. This is from Tim. He says that going back to Wild Beyond, you said that you couldn't get the details down because then they would end up looking so small and mobile. So what do you do to make sure those parts more distinct, visible, like color, shapes, etc.?
I didn't do anything with the colors or shapes. I'm just doing motion. So my job is really specific. Sometimes it's a lot of making the motion bigger. So actually, that's one of the things. Sometimes you have to do the appropriate amount of motion for whatever. So I would say I call it motion style. So if you have like this tiny character, maybe he's like hopping around as he walks. Because if it's just like a realistic walk cycle, like viewed really small, you're not going to really see it. So it's basically making it readable, like doing what you can to make the motion readable. The other challenge was there's so many things when there's like 100 things on screen, and they're all kind of like popping around. It gets kind of vibrating. So you have to kind of, for games like a Clash of Clans type thing, you'd have to kind of like dumb them down because you're doing motion with like lots of patterns. So if it's like a swarm of bees and they're all doing crazy things, it gets too distracting. So yeah, there's not much you can do other than try to like make it readable.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. You were so full of information and knowledge, and your demo reels just speak for itself.
Well, thank you.
We really appreciate it that you took the time to see us. Everybody, thank you so much for coming and asking such really great questions. Samuel over here says, thank you for the presentation. You can see the list of thank yous. If you guys want to keep in contact with Jeff, you can find him in LinkedIn. And of course, he's got his own personal website, but keep an eye on his golf mermaid game. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Take care, Jeff. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Take care, everybody.
Good chatting with you.